The first time I met David Chen, I was neck-deep in a blizzard with a search dog whose nose was literally the only reason. We weren't going to die in the next 5 minutes. And he was walking toward me out of the white like he had all the time in the world. I'm James Mitchell, 25, Vermont State Trooper K-9 handler. My dog is Ranger, a 2-year-old German Shepherd with the kind of instincts that save lives. My job is to follow those instincts and trust them completely. Even when visibility is so bad you can't see 10 feet in front of your face. Even when your hands are numb and your lungs are screaming and your whole body is telling you to turn back. That's what I was doing when David showed up. We had a missing persons call at 602 hikers from Massachusetts. Left the trail around 1400 the previous day, didn't check in by evening. Classic scenario. Young couple, overconfident about their abilities, thought they could push to the summit and back before dark. By the time SAR mobilized at 0400, the weather had deteriorated from bad to actively trying to murder you. Blizzard conditions, wind gusts hitting 50 knots, temperature dropping toward -20 with wind chill, the kind of conditions where people die fast. I was at SAR command by 0530, with Ranger already suited up in his gear protective booties. Reflective collar, the works. The wind was so loud you had to shout to be heard. Snow was falling so thick it seemed solid, like walking through a wall. Handler Mitchell, a voice cut through the wind. And I turned to see a man in a bright orange SAR jacket approaching through the white. His face half covered by a balaclava, eyes barely visible above it. He was tall, lean, moving with a specific gait of someone who'd spent years on mountains. I'm David Chen, NOAA Avalanche forecaster. We need to talk about route safety before you deploy further. I was already moving, my hand on Ranger's collar. We're wasting daylight. Every minute we wait, every minute you deploy wrong, you waste your own life and your dog's. He was right next to me now, and I could see his eyes clearly dark, intelligent, completely serious. I know you have training, but I've been monitoring this specific area for 3 weeks, and I need you to listen to me. There was something in his voice that made me pause. Not authority, new authority, and it usually came from people who'd never been on a mountain in a blizzard. This was different. This was the voice of someone who actually understood something. I'm listening, I said. The snowpack up there is unstable. He pointed upslope toward where I'd been planning to deploy the eastern ridge that cut directly toward the last known location of the hikers. I've been analyzing ice cores, temperature gradients, and wind loading patterns. There's a weak layer about 18 inches down, and the new snow from this system destabilized it further. You go down that ridge with your dog, you're going to trigger a slide. The hikers went that way. I know. Which is why we need a different route. One that keeps you and your dog alive long enough to find them. He pulled out a laminated topographic map from his jacket, already marked with colored lines and detailed notations. Red lines marked the compromised ridge. Blue lines marked an alternative route. This ridge is compromised. This one is safer. It adds 40 minutes to your search time, but it doesn't bury you. I looked at the map, then at him, then at Ranger, who was staring intently upslope at something I couldn't see. My dog's nose was working overtime, his body posture saying, I smell them up there. I can find them. Every instinct I had 3 years of SAR training, 2 years of K-9 partnership. My entire understanding of how search and rescue works said to trust Ranger and deploy directly, but something in how this man said it made me hesitate. You're sure about this? I asked because my dog is telling me they went up that ridge, and my dog is very rarely wrong. Your dog's nose is probably accurate, David said. Scent plumes carry downwind. If they're anywhere upslope, your dog would smell them from here. But smell isn't trajectory. He pointed at the ridge again. Gravity is trajectory, and gravity says that ridge is going to move. How sure are you? Completely. No hesitation. No hedging. Just absolute certainty. I've spent the last week analyzing every slope in this area. I know where the weak points are. That ridge is a loaded gun waiting. For the wrong footstep, it's at about 5 seconds. To make a decision, that could mean the difference between finding 2 hikers alive and finding them buried under 20 feet of snow. 5 seconds to choose between the instinct I'd spent years developing and the expertise of a stranger. So I trusted him. "Okay," I said. "We take the longer route. You're coming with us." He nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Let's move." The longer route was brutal. We took a circling approach that added nearly 2 miles to the search pattern. Me, David, 2 other SAR-techs named Marcus and Riley, and Ranger, who alternated between the steep slope itself and the safer ridge, following his nose and his training. David stayed close the entire time, talking constantly about snow composition and weather patterns and the specific physics of why certain slopes fail. "See how the winds shape the snow here?" he said, pointing at a cornisand overhanging wave of snow at the ridgeline. "That tells me wind loaded the slope from the northwest. That means the weakest point is probably facing southeast. That's where failure would start, if it started." "When?" Marcus said. "Not if, when." When David agreed without missing a beat, probably within the next 12 hours, given how the temperature's dropping and the winds increasing. It should have been annoying, the constant narration. Instead, it was the only thing keeping me alive. Every observation he made was correct. Every prediction he gave about where the slope would fail matched the physical evidence in front of us. "Your dog," he said, watching Ranger navigate a particularly treacherous section of slope. "He's remarkable. He's trained," I said. But even as I said it, I understood what David was seeing. No, he's remarkable. David was watching Ranger with the kind of focus that made me think he actually saw what he was looking at. The way someone really understands something. He's using air scent right now, not ground scent. He's reading air currents and wind patterns. He understands air movement the way I understand snow compression. I hadn't thought about it that way. Ranger was just Ranger. My partner, my responsibility, my job. But David was right. Ranger was doing something I couldn't do. Reading an environment that was trying to kill us. Finding the patterns in the chaos that didn't make sense to anyone but him. "You really understand how systems work," I said. "I understand systems," David said. "Weather systems, snow systems, animal instinct systems. They're all about reading patterns in data that looks random until you understand it." He paused, watching Ranger work. "And your dog understands systems better than most people I know." Around hour 4 of the search, we'd covered about 6 miles and were approaching the area where the hiker's last GPS ping had come from. The visibility had actually improved slightly. We were now at a point where we could see maybe 50 feet in front of us instead of 10. But the wind was getting worse. Ranger went rigid on the slope. That specific posture that means he's found something. His whole body went still. His nose pointed downslope at roughly a 45-degree angle. His ears forward with complete focus. "He's got something," I said, already moving toward him. "Hold on." David was looking at the slope, his expression completely serious. "This is where I need you to trust me again." "What do you mean?" "Your dog found scent. Something human. Downslope from here." He was pointing at the ridge above UST, one we deliberately avoided. "But if we follow him down that slope, and if that slope moves, we don't get back up." I looked at Ranger, who was vibrating with the intensity of the find. My dog had found something. My dog was telling me, "Your people are down there, let me show you." Every fiber of my being wanted to follow him. "We mark it," I said. We radio it in. We establish a perimeter from the safer route. David nodded once. That's the right call. We marked the location bright orange, flagging tied to a fixed rock. GPS coordinates recorded and radioed it into command. We have a scent alert at grid reference 7904 Echo. I said into the radio. Establishing perimeter. Deploying lower slope teams from safer approach. The SAR coordinator came back immediately. Copy that, Mitchell. We're deploying backup teams to access from the southern approach. Ranger wanted to go further down. His nose was working overtime, his body language saying, I know where they are. Let me show you. I can find them. But I held him close, keeping him on the safer ridge, forcing myself not to follow my best instinct. David was watching the slope intently. Temperatures dropping. Winds increasing. That slope is getting less stable, not more. How long do we have? I asked, before it fails. Maybe 6 hours. Maybe less. He looked at me. But the people down there, they're in a shelter probably. If they've dug in, they're protected from the immediate avalanche impact. Probably, Marcus said. Not definitely. No, David agreed. Not definitely. But going down that slope with an unstable pack is definitely death. For you, for your dog, and for the rescue operation that would have to recover your bodies. I was standing on a slope in a blizzard, my dog pulling toward people who needed help, feeling my own training and instinct screaming at me to deploy, while also hearing the voice of a man who understood snow better than I. Understood breath telling me that survival required me to not follow my instinct. It was the hardest thing I'd done in my career. We establish a perimeter, I said finally. We wait for the lower teams to access from the southern approach. And we hold this position. David squeezed my shoulder once. You just made the hardest decision you'll ever make. And you made it right. The shelter was found 42 minutes later by a ground team approaching from the southern ridge. The longer route that David had insisted would work. One hiker with a severe tibial fracture, one hiker with moderate hypothermia but stable vitals. Both of them huddled in a snow cave they dug when they realized they were lost. Alive thanks to the longer route that David had insisted on. Thanks to Ranger's nose that had located them without requiring us to trigger an avalanche. Thanks to a man in a bright orange jacket who understood snow better than anyone I'd ever met. We got them stabilized by 15:30. The helicopter evacuation took another 90 minutes in these conditions. Weather was still brutal. Visibility was marginal. But the pilot was good and the landing zone was secure. By 1700, both hikers were being rushed to Rutland Regional Medical Center with a police escort and a massive wave of relief flooding through every single person on that mountain. I was standing on the safer ridge, watching the second helicopter lift off into the white when David appeared next to me. Ranger was sitting at my feet, his job done, his entire body radiating that deep exhaustion that comes from working hard and knowing you did it right. You called it right, I said. About the slope. If we'd gone down there, you wouldn't have. He was watching the helicopter disappear into the white. You would have survived. Your dog would have survived. But you would have spent the rest of your life wondering if they died because you couldn't reach them, when really they were already safe in that shelter. The slope never did fail, by the way. But it could have, and that's all that matters. How did you know? I asked. About snow, I mean? How do you understand it so well that you can just predict it? I spent 7 years studying it. He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I could see his full face without the balaclava or the goggles. Sharp features, intelligent dark eyes that somehow looked warm despite the cold. A small scar on his right cheekbone that suggested his own dangerous history. Started with geology in grad school, specialized in snow science. Got recruited to NOAA. Moved here 18 months ago because Vermont actually has mountains and actual avalanche danger. Not just theoretical problems. So you're obsessed with snow? I said. I'm dedicated to understanding snow, he corrected. Obsessed implies it's unhealthy. What I do saves lives. That's not obsession. That's purpose. He was right. And it was the exact same reason I did what I did not, because I was obsessed with dogs. But because understanding dogs could save lives. You made a choice today that most people couldn't make. David continued. You had to choose between trusting your dog and trusting me. You trusted both of us. That takes courage. That took sense. You knew something I didn't. Yeah, but you didn't know that I knew. He met my eyes directly. You trusted me on faith and analysis, and it turned out I was right. But if I'd been wrong, you would have stood on that ridge knowing you'd second-guessed your dog because of a stranger. Were you wrong? No, but I could have been. He was looking at me intently now. The point is you made a choice that required you to override your instinct based on someone else's expertise. That takes something most people don't have. It takes trust. I was suddenly very aware of how close we were standing. The wind was howling around us. The white was still falling. And we were both covered in frost and snow and the physical residue of standing on a mountain together. I was aware that my dog was sitting between us like he was guarding something precious. I was aware that something had shifted in me, something about standing in chaos with a man who understood a completely different kind of system. Someone who trusted me to make the right call, just like I'd trusted him. I think, I said carefully, that I trusted you because of how you talked about snow. Like it was a language you actually understood. And because when I looked at you on that mountain, I believed you actually cared whether we died or not. His eyes did something complicated. I did. I do. He set his radio down. James, I haven't been to Vermont very long. I don't have a lot of people here I call friends. And today, I met someone who trusted me when it mattered. Someone who understands how to read danger systems the way I do. Someone whose dog, he glanced at Ranger. Whose dog saved lives because of the work you do together. And, I prompted. And I'm going to ask you if you want to see me again. Not as a SAR colleague. Not as a professional relationship. He met my eyes directly. As someone I'd like to know better. Someone I'd like to get coffee with. Someone I'd like to understand. I've thought about the mountain. About standing in a whiteout with a man whose voice cut through the chaos like a rope, steady and certain and right. About trusting him when my dog pulled toward danger. About recognizing in that moment something that felt like the beginning of something that might matter. Yeah, I said. That's something I'd want. He smiled, small, genuine, the kind that changes a whole face. Good. Because I was pretty sure I was going to stand here in the snow until you said yes. We didn't start easy. Coffee became dinner. And dinner became hiking when the weather cleared enough to be safe not for rescue, but for pleasure. For walking on mountains together without the pressure of emergency, without someone's life depending on our decisions. David would point out snow formations and explain why certain slopes were stable or unstable. I would watch Ranger explore and explain why he moved the way he did. How he was constantly reading his environment. We discovered that we spoke the same. Language, the language of reading systems and understanding patterns and knowing that the right choice, even when it's hard, is the one that keeps everyone alive. David learned that I'm terrible at cooking, but excellent at listening. That I have a specific way of paying attention that makes people feel heard. That I'm stubborn and careful at the same time, which he said was annoyingly attractive. I learned that David is obsessive about weather instruments and topographic maps and will absolutely derail any conversation to talk about snow compression. That he'll drop anything to help someone in danger. That he has a laugh that sounds like it surprised him every time he makes it. Ranger learned that David was acceptable. From a K-9 perspective, That's the highest form of approval. 3 months in, we were sitting in David's apartment, which was basically a shrine to weather. Instruments and topographic maps and satellite imagery. When he said something that made my chest do that specific thing it did whenever I was learning to trust him. "I've been offered a position," he said. His voice was casual, but his hands were tense. "Colorado. They want someone to set up an avalanche forecasting program for 3 mountain ranges. Better pay, better lab setup, more prominence in the field. It's the kind of opportunity that only comes once." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Oh, we were sitting on his couch. Ranger was sprawled across both our laps, which was technically not allowed, but which David had stopped enforcing about 2 weeks in. The moment stretched out in front of me, the moment where he tells me he's leaving, where I have to pretend to be happy for him, even though the thought makes me feel like I'm falling down an avalanche. "But I'm not taking it," David said. I looked at him. "What?" "I'm not taking it." He turned to face me fully. I could see the decision written all over his face, a choice he'd already made and was just telling me about. Because there's someone here who understands what I do in a way most people don't. Because there's a dog here who makes decisions about life and death with more grace than most humans. And because I learned on a mountain in a blizzard that sometimes the most important thing isn't the career option in front of you. It's the person standing next to you. He reached over, took my hand. His palm was warm, his grip steady, the same hand that had held the map on the mountain. The same hand that had squeezed my shoulder when I made the hard choice. The same hand that had pointed toward safety when everything else was telling me to go toward danger. "I want to stay," he said. "Here in Vermont. With you and Ranger. If that's something you want, it's something I want," I said. And I kissed him there on a couch covered in K-9 fur and weather maps, with my dog pressed between us like he was approving the whole situation. The next 3 months were about building something real. David applied for a permanent position with NOAA's Vermont field office. I requested a transfer to a K-9 unit that focused more on rescue work and less on police patrol. We started looking at apartments together, something with space for Ranger to run, something with room for David's weather instruments, something that felt like a place we were choosing together. 6 months after the blizzard, we went back up the mountain. It was summer by then. The snow had melted completely, revealing the green underneath trees and grass and the specific alpine beauty of a Vermont summer. The ridge that had been so unstable, so dangerous, was now just a ridge. But David insisted on going back. "I need to show you something," he said. We were hiking, just the 2 of us. No SAR gear, no emergency. Ranger was leading the way, his nose checking every tree and rock like he was cataloging the mountain's secrets. About why that slope matters. We got to the ridge around 1600. In summer light, it looked completely different. The snow was gone. The danger was invisible. But David walked me across the top and showed me where the weak layer would have been, where the temperature gradient would have created the unstable conditions. "In winter, you can't see the danger," he said. "You have to trust the data. You have to understand the systems. You have to believe that sometimes what looks solid is actually fragile. And in summer," I asked, "in summer, you see what you could have lost." He sat down on a rock that overlooked the entire valley, and I sat next to him. Ranger settled at our feet with his head on David's boot. I was so scared on that mountain. Not about the avalanche. I understood the avalanche. I was scared that you wouldn't trust me, that you'd follow your dog and your instinct, and I'd have to stand there knowing what was going to happen and being unable to stop it. "I trusted you," I said. "I know. But that's not small." He took my hand. Trust is the rarest thing. It's harder to give than love, harder to earn than respect. And you gave it to me when every system you'd trained your whole life told you not to. You earned it, I said. By knowing something I didn't. By caring about whether I survived, I earned it by being right once. He was looking at me intently. But I could have been wrong. And you'd have given me that trust anyway. Based on something you recognized in how I spoke about my work, I thought about how I'd known. Within moments of meeting him, that David understood something true. That certainty had a specific tone, and David had it. I think I loved you on that mountain, I said. I think I started loving you when you told me the ridge was compromised. And I've just been catching up to it ever since. He kissed me there on the ridge, with the summer sun on our faces and my dog's head on his boot and the entire Vermont landscape spread out below us. It was the kind of kiss that feels like coming home and falling off a cliff at the same time. I love you too, he said when we broke apart, in a completely terrifying and permanent way. Permanently terrifying or terrifyingly permanent? I asked. Both, he said. Definitely both. Asterisk epilogue. 1 year later, we were standing on the same ridge, the safe ridge. One that David had approved and marked on 17 different weather maps. Watching the sunset paint the Vermont mountains in colors that felt impossible, remember David said? His arm around me, when you thought you had to choose between trusting your dog and trusting me. Yeah, it was the scariest 5 seconds of my life. You didn't actually have to choose, though. You just had to trust both of us. Ranger was lying at our feet, exhausted from a day of hiking. He was getting older. His movements slower, but his instincts were still sharp. His head rested on David's boot the way it always did, like he'd decided this was acceptable and had stopped reconsidering it. That's not how trust usually works, I said. You usually have to choose. You usually have to pick one system and ignore the others. No, David said. You usually think you have to choose. But with the right people, lure the right dog. Or the right person who understands that dog you don't. You just trust all of it. I kissed him there on the ridge, with the Vermont mountains spread out below us and my dog at our feet. And a man who understood systems better than anyone I knew, telling me that sometimes the most complex system is the one where everyone trusts each other. Completely, the first time I met David Chen. I was neck-deep in a blizzard and he was walking toward me out of the white like he had all the time in the world by the time the sun set over Vermont. I understood he'd been walking toward me the whole time. All we had to do was recognize it. All we had to do was trust each other enough to choose, even when every system we'd trained ourselves in told us to follow a different path. Next year, David said, we should come back here for our anniversary. Same ridge, same dog, same light. That's very romantic for a man who's supposed to be obsessed with weather data, I said. I'm obsessed with weather data, but I'm in love with you. He kissed the top of my head, and those two things can definitely coexist. Ranger made a small sound, half growl, half approval, and settled deeper into the rock he was resting on. The mountains darkened as the sun sank lower, and I thought about how sometimes the most important thing isn't the choice you make. It's the person standing next to you when you're making it.